Hello, and welcome to all of you joining us from LinkedIn, YouTube, and La Vanguardia. And just remember that this session will be available on demand for all of you just as soon as the session is over in our LinkedIn page. And now, without much further ado, let me introduce Joaquín Duato, our speaker today. It's wonderful to have him here because he will tell us about what we all want to know, which is the search for the COVID-19 vaccine. So Joaquín Duato is the vice chairman of the executive committee of Johnson & Johnson, and he is the responsible for the company's pharmaceutical, consumer, IT, and supply chain divisions. Joaquín, thank you very much for joining us today. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Professor Mas, for inviting me to participate today, and it's a pleasure to be here to talk to you about the search for a COVID vaccine and all the innovation that is going on in healthcare during this pandemic.
We are looking forward to know how all this is going. Before I ask you my first question, however, let me remind everybody that you can ask your own question using the comments part on LinkedIn or in YouTube, and then I will be just getting all these questions and posing them to Mr. Duato. So, Mr. Duato, what does it mean for a company as big as yours and in the healthcare sector, facing this COVID that we have been seeing? How does a company like yours face this pandemic?
Johnson & Johnson is the largest healthcare company in the world. So when we are faced with a challenge to the global community as COVID-19 poses, we immediately recognized that we needed to step up. In order to step up, we are mobilizing our global reach. We are a company that is present everywhere in the world. Our financial strength, we are one of the few companies that is AAA rating by credit rating agencies. Our deep scientific expertise, we're one of the largest R&D investors in the world. We invest in excess of $10 billion per year in R&D. And we have also an extensive network of partnerships with academic institutions and biotech. So when we think about a situation like this, what we say, and I think it's more than a slogan, is that a company like Johnson & Johnson is built for times of crisis like this. So when we were faced with COVID-19, one of the important things that we needed to figure out is what were the priorities that a company like us was going to have in these unprecedented times. So for us, it was relatively easy because we already had our credo to provide a blueprint for decision-making during these times. In fact, every aspect of our COVID-19 response has been guided by our credo, which for those of you who are not familiar with our credo and not familiar with Johnson & Johnson, our credo is a 76-year-old statement of principles that outlines a hierarchy of stakeholders. It calls to put people first by taking care of our patients, by taking care of the consumers, by taking care of the dedicated employees who work with us, by taking care of the communities in which we live and work. If we do all that, then financial success as an organization will follow. So that's the basic principle of our credo. You take care of your patients, consumers, employees, and communities, and then financial success will follow. So our response to the COVID-19 crisis and pandemic reflects those priorities of our credo. First and foremost, we are prioritizing the safety and well-being of the employees of Johnson & Johnson. Then we make sure that we continue to supply the critical medicines, devices, and consumer health products that customers and patients depend on. We are also mobilizing to provide equipment, training, products, and financial donations to support communities and healthcare workers on the front lines. And finally, which is what we are here today to talk about, we are collaborating to accelerate the development of our COVID-19 vaccine candidate. It also helps that we've been a company that has been around for 135 years. We have a very seasoned leadership team, and we have seen a thing or two over the decades, and we are able to bring this collective experience to the table during these times. So overall, we are working to address this crisis from every aspect of our business, and we're just getting started.
Thank you very much. So with your final mention to the vaccine, could you help us understand a little bit better the process of bringing an approved vaccine to the market and developing this approved vaccine? Because that's what we all want to know right now. You know, how long is it going to take? What's behind it?
I know everyone listening today, and the same goes for you and me, Professor Mas, has been touched directly by COVID-19, whether you have fought the disease yourself or you have watched a friend or a loved one do so. Now, after all this time, we understand better that the virus is here to stay, and that the only way to address this pandemic is to have a safe and effective vaccine. So I know a number of you or may have the question of, when will I be able to get a vaccine so I can get back to my normal life? And I think that everyone is trying to become during these days a bit of an armchair expert on vaccine development. But many of you may not fully understand the process of how the pharmaceutical and biotech industry has been able to expedite the production on a process that could take as long as 10 to 15 years to more like 15 to 18 months. And I also know many of you may be skeptical by asking, if this is the fastest vaccine development process ever, does it mean that you are cutting corners? The short answer, as you can imagine, is no. But let me tell you a little bit more about the process and what you can expect in the months ahead. So first, a little bit of a primer on what actually vaccines do. Essentially, vaccines mimic a natural infections as closely as possible without getting a healthy person sick. This happens because your immune system builds a defense system against the antigen in the vaccine. And there are different ways to accomplish that, which is what you are hearing in the news about companies using different technologies and having varying development timelines. Vaccines can contain, for example, whole viruses that have either been weakened or inactivated. They can contain just components of the virus, such as pieces of DNA, RNA, or proteins, or they can contain a viral vector that has been genetically engineered so it can produce viral proteins in the body. All of these vaccines eventually trigger an immune response to allow the immune system to develop protection against certain illnesses without causing severe disease. Many companies are now creating vaccines involving only the spike protein of the COVID-19 virus. This is a protein on the surface of the coronavirus that attaches to the human cell it is trying to enter. The goal is to help the immune system identify the spike protein so that it will recognize the same protein on a virus particle if an individual is later exposed to an infection, enabling the immune system to fight the infection before the person becomes sick or unwell. Now, now that you know the vaccine intended purpose and how it works, you may be wondering, will it be effective and how long will it last? Will it be more like the measles vaccine, where you get a few doses and have a long-term immunity? Or will it be more like seasonal flu, where you need to get regular vaccinations because the virus mutates? Based on what COVID-19 vaccine developers are seeing right now, the coronavirus and its spike protein in particular have not appeared to mutate significantly to date. So that means that there is a greater likelihood that the vaccines under development will successfully induce immune responses to recognize the virus currently circulating in the community. While we don't know how long the immunity created by a vaccine will last, because we are in the earliest stages of clinical development, we're hopeful it will have a good immunogenic effect.
Thank you. So I'm a little bit more optimistic now that I see that it's not mutating, and you also asked, well, is it going to develop an immune response that it's going to last? And I see that it's wait and see. But can you tell us a little bit more, instead of about the vaccine in general, about the Johnson & Johnson's effort in the vaccine? Maybe you can tell us a little bit more about what we can expect from your front.
Yeah. So before I go that, Professor Mas, let me tell you more about the development process, and then I will go directly into the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. So the scientific community and the vaccine manufacturers have begun with exploratory and preclinical research that tries to assess the safety of a candidate and its ability to spark this immune response that we were commenting. And that exploratory and preclinical research often takes place in cells or in animals. So once an animal is vaccinated, it develops antibodies, and it says it's often this animal is exposed to the virus to see if enough antibodies have been produced to provide protection against the disease. Then once we see the efficacy and the safety in animals, then we move into humans and we do clinical research in humans. And typically, this clinical research has three phases for those of you that are not familiar. The first one is phase 1, that is the smallest one, and is designed to generate safety data and to see if the vaccine actually induces an immune response. In other words, if it produces antibodies. The second one is phase 2, which is typically a little larger, involving several hundred individuals and can include both healthy adults and those more likely to get the virus. And the testing is designed to study if the vaccine's safety, immune response, and proposed dosing schedule and delivery method are good and are appropriate for the response you want to create. And finally, you do the larger studies, the phase 3 studies that involve tens of thousands of participants, because it needs to be big enough to confirm that the vaccine is effective in the real world. These are often what we call double-blind and placebo control, so people do not know if they are getting the vaccine or not, and you have a group that gets the vaccine and a group that doesn't get the vaccine, and they test to assess safety as well as efficacy. So we answer the following question: does the vaccine prevent the disease? Does the vaccine prevent infection from the pathogen? Does it lead to the production of antibodies or other types of immune responses related to the pathogen? So then that data is collected, analyzed, and normally this process takes, years, as long as I have described before, 10 to 15 years. And after that, the companies continue to study the vaccine and look at its efficacy in other populations. Fortunately, in this particular case of the COVID-19 virus, companies had a head start on the discovery and preclinical research phase of the vaccine. The SARS and MERS epidemics in the past gave us a clue about it. The SARS and the COVID-19 virus are nearly 80% identical, and both use spike proteins, the proteins that I mentioned earlier, to attach to a specific receptor found on the cells in human lungs. So manufacturers have been able to move into the clinical development process a bit more rapidly than usual, because we had this research that was done earlier for SARS and MERS. Then, working closely with the governments, given the pandemic situation, we have been able to expedite the clinical development process. In certain countries, like in the US, companies can apply to regulators for what is called a special emergency use authorization process, which allows the vaccines to come to market before they would have otherwise. For example, the FDA allows companies to apply for this expedited pathway once you have interim data from your phase 2b/3 studies. And many companies, what they're doing now is trying to combine the phases that I was describing before in order to be able to accelerate the clinical development. For example, in our case, our vaccine candidate, we have announced last month that based on the strength of our preclinical data, we are accelerating our phase 1/2a human clinical studies to start later this month. This is going to be a randomized double-blind placebo-controlled trial that is going to evaluate safety response to vaccination, and also an immune response to a vaccine candidate in more than 1,000 healthy adults aged 18 to 55 years, as well as adults aged 65 years and older. And we are already in discussions with the NIH and the FDA with the objective to start our phase 3 study ahead of its original schedule once we have data from our phase 1/2A studies from an approval from regulators. So, that is how we are trying to accelerate how we do the clinical development of these vaccines, by combining phases and by leveraging research that we have done in the past. At the same time, we have to conduct the clinical trials, and we have to have sufficient numbers for our phase 3 trial to be able to test our vaccine in the real world. So we are using data science and data science tools to predict and plan where our studies are going to take place to ensure that we do it in the areas where the virus is more prevalent.
And see, because I can tell you that basically I saw, once you showed this slide of 10 to 15 years, I saw a lot of questions on my screen of people getting a little bit nervous. So we're glad to see that this is accelerating. And maybe, at the end, I'm going to ask you for a date, because we have several questions on that. If everything goes well, when can we have that into the market, if everything goes well, no? Because it's a long process for what we have seen. But meanwhile, we also have some questions thinking, about, in your opinion, which type of process should companies follow when they have to decide on a price for this COVID vaccine? Because that's the next issue, right? There's the issue of developing it, bringing it into the market, but then, which pricing should we be thinking about? Which process should companies be considering when pricing something as important for everybody as this COVID-19 vaccine?
Yeah, and I'm going to answer that, Professor Mas, but an important aspect in the development of the vaccine, it's also a critical one in this case, is the manufacturing of it. So let me address that topic before I go to pricing, because it's sequential. First, typically it has been sequential, then you develop a vaccine, then you manufacture it, and then you price it. What we are doing now is that we are doing it all at the same time. So we are, researching the vaccine, developing the vaccine, and manufacturing the vaccine at the same time. So that's behind our ability to compress the timelines, that we are starting to manufacture the vaccine even before we have the clinical data. So that is a key element here. And I think it's a key element also for the availability of the vaccine down the road, to what extent companies are going to be able to manufacture this vaccine in the required quantities, which are not going to be in millions, but in billions, in order to address the situation, right? So let me talk to you a little bit about, that aspect which is so critical, which is the manufacturing of the vaccine, and then I will go into the pricing one that I know it's one that raises a lot of questions. But truly, manufacturing here is a key component of being able to compress the time. So why can companies manufacture in a way that can address that? Because we are also leveraging technologies that we had before. Not only we understood the virus better because of our previous research in SARS and MERS, but for example, in our case, we are using for our COVID-19 vaccine the same technology that we have used in the development of our other vaccines, in particular in our Ebola vaccine that was approved last week by the European community. And we have used that technology in our Zika, RSV, and HIV vaccines. So it's a technology platform that we have already used in the past, then that gives us confidence on the safety of the technology and also on the actual manufacturability of the technology. So how does the manufacturing process works in a vaccine? So our technology works the following way. We use an adenovirus or a common cold virus as a carrier, as a vector, we call it. And then we modify that adenovirus to mimic components of the genetic code of the virus of the COVID-19 virus. So that is the carrier. So then we use that vector and we put it in a cell line that multiplies this carrier to produce it in a cost-effective way so we can scale up manufacturing in a relatively short period of time. To give you an idea, we use 1,000-liter bioreactors, and these 1,000-liter bioreactors can produce vectors for over 1 million vaccine doses. So it's a high productivity manufacturing system that enables us to produce a large number of vaccine doses. We have to purify and then formulate these vaccines and then put it on vials, and then they can be stored for use. Knowing that we need to produce more than 1 billion vaccines, and that's a very large number, what we have been doing already now is expanding our global manufacturing capacity, including establishing new manufacturing capabilities in the places where we had them and establishing them all over the world. So our main vaccine production facility is in Europe, in Leiden, Holland, and we are establishing manufacturing capacity in other parts. I brought here a picture of our first vaccine doses coming from our Leiden manufacturing facility, which happened last week, which are now going to be used in the phase 1/2A clinical trial that will start later this month that I commented. So as I said, we are creating this network of manufacturing in order to be able to address a global demand that we expect to be in the billions. And that is a key component of us being able to compress the time. That at the same time we are doing the development, we are doing the manufacturing, so when and if it becomes approved, we will be ready to actually deploy the vaccine into the real world. So let's go into the price component. And look, pricing is something that different companies are going to approach in different ways. We are committed to bringing an affordable COVID-19 vaccine to the public at a not-for-profit price for the emergency pandemic use. So that's our commitment. Different companies may have different ways of approaching that. Our commitment is that we are going to bring it to the public at a not-for-profit basis for emergency pandemic use. And this is a commitment that we are doing based on our credo that I described before, in which we need to be able to serve all our stakeholders. The not-for-profit price of our vaccine candidate will be determined using a not-for-profit framework, which is consistent with established vaccine costing methodologies, such as those used by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So that's what we will establish, a not-for-profit price. This not-for-profit price factors the investment and efforts, excluding any profit or return on investment. And this is exceptional, and we are doing it on exceptional basis because we are in an exceptional situation. This is not many times in our lifetime that we're going to go through a situation like this, so we decided that we were going to do something exceptional. So for us and for the executive committee at Johnson & Johnson, when confronted with the COVID-19 vaccine, based on the principles of our credo, there was no doubt that we wanted to make it available at a not-for-profit price for emergency pandemic use. And it was a relatively easy decision for us, and that's the way we are doing it. Now, I also respect that different companies may have different ways of pricing the vaccine. Overall, it's important to recognize that this vaccine should get to everybody. And if you want to make access to this vaccine as broad as possible, then you have to make it accessible from a pricing perspective. And that's our intention behind the not-for-profit price.
Thank you, and absolutely. I mean, it should reach everybody for many reasons, for the humanitarian perspective, but also if you think about, what's happening to the whole globalized world, we will not be able to do business as usual, life as usual, until everybody is also protected, right? But so you mentioned the way in which you are anticipating the production, and we have seen this picture. You talked about pricing, but what about deciding how this is going to be distributed, who ultimately is going to be getting it, right? Because even though you are anticipating the production very quickly, the first ones will go somewhere and so on. So what about the way in which we should be thinking about what's happening?
That's a great question, and obviously ramping up the production to meet the global demand will take some time. So I have to say that up front. So, I mean, while we are going to be able to produce more than 1 billion vaccines, ramping up that production to meet the global demand will take some time. So we are committed to providing the vaccine both in the developed and developing world. That's our first commitment. So we are in conversations with different parties in the developed world, but also with different organizations that work in supplying vaccines to the developing world. So we are committed to supplying the vaccine both to developed countries and also to developing countries. And that's a very important principle for us. So, I anticipate this conversation. It's going to be important, and it's going to be even more important when the vaccine is approved. We will work into it that now. Eventually, the decisions of how to deploy the vaccine in a country, it's going to be up to each country governing body, which is going to play an important role in purchasing and distributing the vaccine. So our principles, or what we recommend, is that if the vaccine proved to be successful and there's an emergency authorization use, the first to get the vaccine should be doctors and nurses and other essential workers which are on the front line. And then seconds to that, or priority, should also be given to individuals who have risk factors that make them more susceptible to the coronavirus, such as elderly. But again, that would vary very much country by country, depending on each country's governments and their decisions in how they want to distribute and how they want to deploy the vaccine in country. Our commitment, as I said before, is that we will supply vaccines both for the developed and the developing world.
And as you said before, these are extraordinary, unique circumstances that will change many things. The way in which we behave in the world will change. And from your point of view, how do you think this pandemic is going to change the way in which companies like yours do research and development, innovation, the way in which they think about the future? What's going to change that?
It's changing things now. I mean, the collaboration that we're seeing now among companies in the life science industry at every level to develop vaccines, treatments, diagnostics, it's unparalleled. And for us, it's important too that we have more than one company developing a vaccine. We would like several companies to be able to be successful in developing a vaccine. And it's been a great opportunity also to work not only within companies, but also with the governments, holding hands with the regulatory authorities in development. So this has created an incredible collaboration. No one manufacturer can do this alone. No one country can do this alone. So at the end of the day, there's no competition here. The only competitor is the virus. There's not competitors in this case. So we will welcome the collaboration with other companies. We would like more than one vaccine coming to the market. It is important to have vaccines, not only our vaccine coming to the market. And I think that this collaboration that has existed between companies and within private and public, it's a good example to continue in the future. What areas would change? Many things are going to change. Is this pandemic going to change things? Yes. My belief is that it's going to mainly accelerate pre-existing trends. In other words, that things that were important trends before now have been vastly accelerated by the COVID-19 situation. What are we going to have that it's going to be accelerated? One thing for one, in the life science industry, it's work in infectious diseases and vaccines. I think pharmaceutical companies, life science companies are going to be work more in pandemic preparation and are going to be more focused in infectious diseases and vaccines and antimicrobials in general than they were before. So that's an area in which R&D is going to be shaped. Another area that is going to be important that we have seen a tremendous change is what you would call broadly digitization. I think that now we are all working from home. We have understand the power of collaboration tools. We have seen the incredible growth of e-commerce. We have seen how of the technologies that we have put in place in our companies in automation are giving us fruits. And I think that this period in which everybody has been forced to be more digital is going to accelerate the digital transformations of the companies in a significant way. A third area in which I think we are going to be changing is in the broad area as we call supply resiliency. I do think that we have learned a lot about supply resiliency during this pandemic. There are a lot of people that depends on our medicines and our medical devices. And the fact that we had a global, well-diversified supply chain has allowed us to continue to supply our products, even when parts of our network were impacted. So I think we have to apply those learnings to come up with more resilient manufacturing and distribution networks that can withstand situations like this. So I do think there are a lot of best practices that we will be able to reference in the future as far as how things are going to change. But the overarching principle for me is that COVID-19 is not going to create new trends. What it's doing is accelerating vastly the pre-existing trends, particularly in the area of digitization and supply chain resiliency.
So accelerating is one of the things. Now, remember that I already had one question from before that I warned you about, but there are many people here that really want to know, and I'm also one of them. So can you give us a time frame? And let me allow you to have us, a broad time frame. So the soonest we can see it, or, when can we see a vaccine? What's your best estimate?
It is, look, this is super risky to give you a vaccine, but if I look at the vaccines that are based on the RNA technology, I described that initially, they are already about going to start phase 3 studies. So if those phase 3 studies have positive interim data, and I put the if conditional, we may see a vaccine that could be approved for emergency use authorization before the end of the year. I'm not talking about hours now. I'm talking about looking at others that are already starting phase 3 studies with mRNA vaccines. I don't know in what quantities they will be able to manufacture at that point, but it's likely that you would see a vaccine in some quantities before the end of the year. Then for vaccines, or several vaccines to come to the market in larger quantities, I think it will be sometime, in the first half of 2020.
Wow, that's actually much faster than these 10 to 15 years that we saw in the picture that has affected many of the questions that we see here. But also, we have several questions from Mike or from Alvaro, Steven, that actually say, is the vaccine the answer? Or, is it better to have a vaccine than to think about tests? Are there alternatives using tests and treatments after that? What would you tell them?
Yeah, but we know now that the virus is not going to be a seasonal one, and is not going to disappear. So, there's going to be different stages. At the stage we are now, testing, tracing, social distancing, deep cleaning, masks are all important components of managing the disease, and governments are approaching this in different ways. Certainly, the second component of that could be treatments. I mean, different companies are investing in treatments for people who has already been infected and that has already shown symptoms of the disease. It's possible that we may have some effective treatments in the future, like, for example, antibodies against the COVID-19 virus. Then ultimately, if you want to prevent the population of getting infected, the only response is a vaccine. So in that sense is when we talk the ultimate response of this pandemic of a vaccine, that's how we are describing it. Evidently, testing, tracing, all the different things that we can do from social distancing and also developing potential treatments are important. But if you want the population to be prevented from getting infected, the ultimate response is a vaccine.
And then related to that, we also have, a curiosity to understand. So once we have this vaccine, how long is it going to take for our community or our society to be immunized? Because now I see everybody adding up, in our minds, how long is it going to take us to have a normal life back again? And how does it work?
The vaccines act relatively quickly. I cannot tell you a time now because we have not done, in our case, the studies in humans to tell you how long does it take to be immunized, but they are relatively quickly, and they will work very similar to other vaccines that people is receiving in the community now. So the key element would be, okay, once the vaccine is developed and approved, then to have sufficient quantities to deploy it to the population. And that would mean that the governments will have to work in purchasing that and then in actually distributing and administering to all the population, which is not an easy task. And it will require some education of all the population of why the population should be vaccinated. But the actual clinical effects of the vaccine, I cannot tell you now because I don't have data from our studies, but you can assume it's going to be similar to other vaccines.
And basically, which percentage of the population do you estimate would need to be vaccinated or immunized somehow, for us to be protected?
I would expect that most of the population, unless there's any type of contraindication, would be vaccinated. I would leave it to the experts. What is the exact percentage of the population that should be vaccinated in order to get let's say the herd immunity? I don't think we have to navigate toward the herd immunity. I think the best thing would be for the majority of the population to be vaccinated. I do believe that these vaccines, if and when they get approved and if they are safe, could be easily deployed to the population at large.
And then we also have some questions saying, okay, you mentioned some of the things that are changing now. One of them is the collaboration. Okay, and we have very positive remarks of saying, wow, it's wonderful that, finally it seems that most of the world is collaborating together. And you even mentioned, I'm okay with many more companies also developing the vaccine because we need a lot of them, in a short period of time. So do you think that some of this collaborative spirit is gonna remain in the industry or in the sector? Or let me broaden the question to the society. Are we learning something from this that will make us, be more efficient, not only with this particular case, but from that, there are many more diseases that would require and benefit a lot from this collaborative experience?
That's a great question. And my hope would be that this pandemic brings societies closer together instead of being divisive. That would be my personal hope. From an industry perspective, clearly, I think it's going to bring companies together in tackling some of the areas that require more extensive, let's call it, what we call pre-competitive collaboration. In other words, to develop the science that is at the base of us later develop the treatments. So I think there's a lot of room for collaboration in certain areas of problems that companies can only tackle together. It can go from antimicrobial research, which antimicrobial resistance is a key problem that societies are facing today. And part of that antimicrobial research and antimicrobial investments can be done collaboratively among the industry, or it can go to other problems where the basic research is still required in order to advance the treatments, such as, for example, Alzheimer's disease. So yes, we are open to collaborations, and our innovation model, it's an open innovation model. In other words, our science, we recognize that the science that we create in our labs doesn't have everything, and it may not be the best. So our innovation model, it's fully open for collaboration and for open research in these areas. One of the things that we have pioneered is the establishment of incubators. We have about 500 companies now that are in residence as incubators with a no strings attached model that they investigate in multiple areas. What we provide them is the space to do it, and we act as their landlord. So this is an example of the open innovation model that we espouse. Innovation, by definition, is not going to occur in a single company or laboratory. It has to occur through collaboration. And I would hope that in these areas, like antimicrobial resistance or neurodegenerative diseases, collaboration exists in order to advance the science, which is at the base of the new treatments.
So we hope that most of these learnings remain. We have just also several questions that have to do with the side effects of this vaccine. And many of them say, well, recently I've been reading about, because we read, as you said at the beginning, we are all becoming experts. We all read all this information. Is there something that you can tell the audience also to ease our minds, about that, and what should we expect? How does the process work, and so on?
It's deep. What I can reassure everybody in the call is that we are doing it with the intent to be able to address an important global pandemic, which is affecting the way we operate, is affecting our lives and our economy. So we are not going to cut a single corner in order to be able to have a safe and effective vaccine. And we are going to be sharing all our data with the regulators, which ultimately they are going to make a decision based on a risk-benefit of the vaccines. So that is our commitment, to be transparent and to provide all the information to the regulators. Overall, vaccines as a public health intervention has been one of the most productive interventions in human history, by far. The life expectancy in the 20th century grew about 30 years overall in the world. Part of it was progress in sanitation, but most importantly, one of the key factors were the vaccines and the widespread vaccination. It has increased life expectancy of the humankind by more than a decade. So I would think that overall vaccines as a public health intervention is one of the most productive, and I would expect that the COVID-19 vaccines would be no different. So yes, we are going to have education about the vaccines, the use, the risk and the benefits. But I think I can represent the industry, that nobody is trying to cut in corners here. We understand the responsibility that we have here. And overall, the vaccines has been, if I would say, the most productive public health intervention that we have ever come up with.
Absolutely. If you look at any result of public health, just hygiene has been maybe the most important one, followed by vaccines, which have made a huge difference in our life expectancy. Just one final question, which is also, some hopefully, an answer for hope, because we have many people concerned about the mutations. So, we've all also read about the mutations. You've said the mutations don't seem to be very big. So some of the questions are, okay, they don't seem to be big now, but imagine, right, that this changes and mutates much faster than what we anticipate. What part of what we will have learned from this first vaccine will make it also fast to get us to the second one or the next one, in case the virus mutates more than what we anticipate now? Is it going to be much, much, much faster? Is it going to be like the flu, or is it going to be something absolutely different that might take another 2 years to solve? If you can answer, because it's very difficult, probably.
Look, I'm not a virologist, as you can tell by what I have described, right? But what I am hearing from the virologists in the company and from other thought leaders in this area is that the spike protein, which is the component of the virus that we are targeting, is quite preserved, and as a consequence, that we're going to be able to have an effective vaccine. If there were mutations in the future, I'm positive and confident that all the experience that we have developed in the existing development and research of this vaccine will help us. Plus, importantly, Professor Mas, will have already all the manufacturing capability required to be able to produce the vaccine. So I think we would be in a much better place than we were before in order to be able to come up with another vaccine candidates. So yeah, I feel confident that if that were the case, and I don't have the knowledge to tell you what is the probability or not of that happening, but if it were the case, based on everything we have been learning during this period and the type of infrastructure we have built in research, development, and manufacturing, we could be much more experienced.
So that's very good news. And just the final question. We have also some people saying, well, while we wait for the vaccine, and we talked a little bit about the test, and but while we wait for this vaccine to come, it seems it's going to be soon, but it's never soon enough, when it affects your life and your society. What should we do? Because we see some countries like the US or some other countries in Latin America, for example, or Russia, India, where the pandemic is spreading pretty quickly. So I know it's not in your, in your area of expertise, but they ask you. So, what should we do as a society meanwhile, to flatten the curve, probably? Or
thank you. I do think we understand now well that the virus is here to stay until we have a vaccine. I think if you would have asked people 4 months ago, people may have thought that there was a certain seasonality or that the virus was going to wane. I think that we can see now that the virus is all over the world, unaffected by climate, and at the same time that it's going to stay here until we find a vaccine or an effective treatment. So because of that, we have to look for the most effective ways of managing our lives and managing our overall situation in the meantime. And the most effective ways have already been described, are the ones that have been used since ancient times. Is social distancing, the use of masks and hand washing, and then obviously today's times, testing and tracing to a larger extent that we have been doing so far. So if we are able to test and trace, and we are able to social distance appropriately, then most likely we'll be able to manage the situation with, sporadic surges in different places and navigate our way until we have the vaccine. But it's important to recognize that the virus is here to stay, and that we're going to have to continue to go through ups and downs until we have that vaccine.
Thank you so much. So, for your very clear explanation, I'm keeping, some of the things that you have said in mind. So probably maybe less than 1 year, right? Until we see the vaccine. The virus is here to stay, as you said, until we have the vaccine. So, it's going to take still a few more months. But meanwhile, companies are speeding up, their production so that when it's ready, it will reach as many people as possible. And also your opinion of prioritizing, health workers and those that are more vulnerable. So thanks a lot for answering all the questions. We have plenty of them coming from YouTube and from LinkedIn. Thanks. And before we close the session, just a last reminder of tomorrow that we have a session in English at 4 p.m. in Spanish time with Professors José Luis Nueno and Mike Rosenberg. We are going to be talking about the impact of the COVID on consumer approaches and the changing that is facing retail, and also inviting you to join our IESE webpage at www.iese.edu. So thanks again for joining us, and thank you so much, Mr. Duato, for your answers and for telling us about the vaccine.
Thank you, Professor Mas, and thank you to all of you for listening. Thank you.